A surprising way to respond to the English opening as black is what's called the Great Snake variation. It starts with the move g6, and a lot of people will play this but then transpose into other openings. But in this video, I'm going to show you what I consider to be the system that you should use if you're going to go for the Great Snake variation and why it's a good option as black against c4. All right, so first of all, the English opening is one of those openings that's kind of flexible for white. Like, there's a lot of ways that they can approach the game after they play c4. Sometimes if you let them, they'll play d4 and just turn it into a queen pawn opening. Sometimes they won't. They'll play knight to c3 and then kind of follow this typical English setup, maybe with g3 and bishop g2. Sometimes they'll play bishop g3, bishop g2, but they won't play the knight out. Sometimes they'll put the pawn on d3. Sometimes they'll put the pawn on e3. Sometimes they'll play e4 pretty early on. There's so many ways that they can approach the game. It's kind of annoying to play against. So one of the things that I recommend when you're playing against openings like this is, instead of learning a specific line, like, okay, if they go here, I have to go here, and if they go here, I have to go here, you learn a system. You learn a setup where it's like, okay, normally I'm going to put my pieces on these squares, and regardless of what my opponent does, I'm going to have a solid setup. That's what you're going to learn in this video. Now, one of the previous videos that I've done on the channel, I've talked about the move bishop b4. This is actually one of my favorite ways to respond to the English. The point is, we're going to give up our bishop, put all our pawns on dark squares, and white's bishop doesn't really have a good outlook for the rest of the game. I'll link that video below if you want to check that out. By all means, that's one option. However, sometimes white will play the move g3, and then we're out of luck. Okay, we don't want to play bishop b4 now because white just simply attacks us. And if we go back, we actually get Noah's Ark trapped. Noah's Ark trapped. We lose our bishop, and that's not how you want to start the game. So when they play this, variation of the English, you have to have another response. So the Great Snake variation, you can play against pretty much anything, okay? Now, the main setup for the Great Snake variation is this: g6, bishop g7, e5, and then you put your pawns on f5 and d6. Okay, this is kind of the starting point for the Great Snake variation, and you can kind of see how it's sort of almost starting to look like a snake, right? You got the way we have our pawns set up, but this is a pretty nice setup. You have nice central control. You have lots of space in the center, so you have options of pushing this pawn at some point and unleashing your bishop and putting pressure on the knight. You can also push here and potentially try to attack on the king side. Even pushing these pawns later is an option. So there's a lot of ways you can approach it, but it's a nice system, and regardless of what your opponent does, most of the time you can play this, okay? Now, I do want to mention something, and this is just my recommendation. It's totally up to you guys, but when they play c4, I recommend you play e5, and then you start going into the setup with g6, bishop g7, f5, and d6, okay? The reason that I recommend that is because when you start with g6, if your opponent wants, they can play d4, and now you can't really play e5. You're into some crazy England gambit type of opening, which is not going to be good for you with the pawn on g6. It's not going to make any sense. So you're out of luck, right, if they do that. So because of that, that's why I recommend playing e5 right away. And now if they ever play d4, you just take it. Right, and we're happy about this because we gain a tempo on the queen, and then I don't know where the queen goes. If they go here, we don't really care. We're going to gain another tempo. This is great for us. We're pretty happy about this, right? So that's my recommendation. Like I said, you don't have to, but I recommend you start with e5, and then you go for the following setup, okay? And usually the game is going to go something like this. A lot of players playing the English are going to go for this setup, and then either bring their knight out, maybe play e3 or d3. Let's just take d3 for an example, and we're going to play d6, okay? So this is kind of the starting point for the game. Knight to f3, knight to f6. Let's just say they castle, and we're going to castle. Okay, this is your setup, and there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of. Number one, when you play an early f5, you always have to keep an eye on this diagonal because there are tactics that might pop up during the game, and you could get into trouble. Okay, so queen to b3 is a move you have to watch out for. Bishop to d5 is a move, or if they play knight to d5 but it's defended by the bishop and you take, maybe the bishop comes in later, right? These are the things you want to keep an eye out. And also knight to g5, okay? And this is another move that you have to be careful, especially when this gets paired with like queen to b3. It can get very dangerous, okay? So I'm going to show you a couple of ways that you can deal with that. Number one, to get off of this diagonal is the simple king to h8. So let's just say, for example, I don't know why it does this. King to h8. It's a move that you can play. You don't have to worry about any more checks. Okay, now the downside to king to h8, let's take a different example for white here. Let's say they play rook to b1, which is pretty common. Let's say we play king h8. The downside to this move is that if knight g5 ever happens, knight to f7 check is a more serious threat. Now in this case, we've got it covered with our rook, but if we made a mistake and moved our rook, look out. We're going to get forked and we're going to lose our queen. Okay, now as long as you're aware of this and you don't let this happen, you're going to be just fine. But I just want to point this out to make sure you don't fall into these traps. Okay, so keep this in mind. King to h8 is one idea. And the other thing, actually after king to h8, sometimes you'll bring your bishop here. Let's just say white plays b4 and we play bishop e6. Now, this is not a good move in this position because of the threat over here. So let me actually back up. I would recommend c6. You want to blunt this bishop, and we'll say, I don't know, white continues doing something over here. Bishop to e6, one thing that you can do when they bring the knight in is you can actually drop your bishop back to g8. Okay, and the bishop is doing a great job of defending all of these squares, and probably next move we're going to play h6 and kick that knight away. Let's say rook e1, h6, the knight goes back, and now we're ready to continue. If we want to bring our bishop out, we can, or we can start pushing the pawns to, attack on the king side, or we can push in the center and attack more in the center after we finish our development. Maybe something like this, and then we could play like d5. Okay, we had to defend this, but now that it's defended, we're good to go here with something like this. Notice we have 1, 2, 3 pieces defending. So we've got lots of defense. We have a nice strong center. Okay, this is kind of the idea of the Great Snake variation. Okay, this is kind of the idea behind this setup. Now, I'm not going to go into every single line that your opponent might play in this video. I want to give you this setup. I want to give you kind of some of the key points and details, and then you can go and have fun and play chess. And it's a system that you can play against the English. Now, couple of things, and I kind of already mentioned this, but rook to b1 is a pretty common plan for white. They like to expand on the queen side, and they don't want their rook to fall into any tactics by sitting there, so they bring it over, and they're going to push on the queen side. One thing that I like to do when I see rook to b1 is the move a5. And it's like, okay, if we know they're going to play b4, why do we play a5? Well, the point is we would like to be able to capture this, and now they have an isolated pawn. And we actually have a rook attacking it, which is really nice for us. Now, most people, when they see a5, what they're going to do is play a3. And we don't care. We keep doing our plan. Let's say c6. This is a pretty, like I said, pretty common setup of the pawns. And when they play b4, we take it. And notice what happened by playing a5 and a3. We have activated our rook along the a file. We didn't even have to move this rook, and it's already lined up and being, very active and making a lot of threats that white's going to have to watch out for, right? So that's a really good, even in a different opening, this is a good idea to keep in your mind, especially when you castle your king on the other side of the board and you're trying to figure out what to do with that rook. Maybe you want to just play a5 and slow down what your opponent is trying to do, okay? So keep that one in mind. And then the other thing is, after we play c6, if they're kind of just playing real passively, which a lot of English players will do, right? Your main setup is going to be bishop to b6, and you can play king h8 first, or you can just play it right away, and if they hit you with the knight, you just come back. You just come back. And you might say, well, didn't we lose a move? Well, not really, and here's why. Because whatever white does next, we're going to follow that up with h6, and now they lose a move and have to go back. And so it kind of evens out, and then we can actually go back to e6, and the game basically goes on as if nothing really happened, except, we got this move in and they got this move in, right? It's kind of the same thing. This is a pretty useful move, actually. A lot of times we can tuck our king here or use this to help push these pawns and attack on the king side, okay? Speaking of attacking on the king side, generally speaking, I would finish your development first. The knight's probably going to go to d7 here. And you're probably going to either bring your queen maybe here or here. Let's say e7 or c7. Let's say e7. And now if you want to start attacking on the king side, here is how I would do it. Okay, this is just me, but let's say white, I don't know, does this. Maybe we take that. I would put my king on h7, and I would think about bringing my rooks over. Now, this is an interesting situation because we do have control of the a file with this rook, so maybe I wouldn't do that. But let's actually go back and let's say white didn't do that. White's, I don't know, doing some other stuff. We put our king here and white's just kind of chilling, playing b3. This is how I would go about attacking. Bring my rook over here and get ready to push these forward. Now, notice how the queen's lined up on the king. Maybe instead of king to h7, we go king to h8. Maybe we feel like this is a safer option. You have to be careful because look at this. 1, 2, 3. It's a triple fork if the knight were to come and attack it. However, that's a pretty easy threat to deal with. We can maybe play queen f7. and the next move we'll play g5, and we can win another tempo on the knight. So I know I'm saying a lot of random stuff, but I want you to be thinking in terms of this when you play, right? This is not memorize these moves and hope for the best. This is think about the ideas, think about the concepts, and play a good game of chess, right? So that's what it is. This is the Great Snake variation. It's, like I said, it's very simple. That's your setup. E5, G6, Bishop G7, push that pawn up, and then D6. Okay? I kind of talked through, you know, some of the ideas. Of course, your opponent might do any number of things, and you'll have to figure that out when you play. But it's a very solid option against the English, and it's not played very often. You will be taking your opponents by surprise when you go for that setup. Let me know what you guys think, how this works out for you, and if you have follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer those. But as always, stay sharp, play smart, and take care.